From the wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, this is Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier with your host, Robin Barefield. In a land full of peril and vicious animals, humans are the most dangerous predators of all.
Imagine alarm bells startling you from a peaceful sleep aboard a luxury cruise ship at 1 a.m. You didn't take the abandoned ship drill seriously on your first afternoon on the boat, and now you struggle to remember what to do in an emergency. You find your life jacket and open the door to your cabin. The passageway smells smoky, and you hear an explosion in the bowels of the large ship. You realize the boat is not moving, and you can't hear the rumble of the engines. Your concern morphs into panic as you race after the other passengers fleeing their cabins. The above scenario played out for the passengers on the cruise liner Prinsendam in the early morning hours of October 4th, 1980. Welcome to Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier. I'm your host, Robin Barefield, and I'm broadcasting to you from the heart of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge on Kodiak Island in Alaska. The Holland America Line began sailing in 1872 and ferried passengers from the Netherlands across the Atlantic to New York City. The company supported the efforts during both World War I and World War II and began expanding international travel. Holland America started doing business in Alaska in 1973 after purchasing West Tours, Inc., an Alaska tourism company. Around the same time, Holland America ordered the construction of a ship built specifically for luxury cruises. The SS Prinsendam cost the company $27 million, and in 1975, the Prinsendam embarked on its first cruise of Alaska's Inside Passage. On September 30th, 1980, the Prinsendam departed Vancouver on a cruise to Japan, with ports of call in Alaska and Asia along its route. The ship carried 524 passengers and crew. Most of the 360 passengers on the long, expensive cruise were elderly Americans. The Prinsendam's first stop was Ketchikan, Alaska, which the ship departed on October 2, 1980. Singapore was its next planned port of call. All went well the following day. The passengers enjoyed an elaborate meal that evening, and some watched the nightly show in the auditorium. A few closed down the bars and were heading for their cabins at 1 a.m. on October 4th, but most passengers were asleep when the alarm bell sounded. During a routine fuel filter change, a spark ignited in the engine room, and the fire spread quickly, engulfing the space. The flames disabled the firefighting pumps, and the Indonesian crew had to fight the growing blaze with carbon dioxide and foam extinguishers. The captain ordered the transmission of an SOS. SOS! SOS! This is the Prinsendam. We have fire in the engine room, and we are dead in the water. SOS! The U.S. Coast Guard communication stations in Kodiak, Alaska, and San Francisco, California, received the security broadcast and immediately relayed it to Air Station Sitka, Marine Safety Office Juneau, and Rescue Coordination Center Kodiak. Sitka had 2 helicopters in the air within 29 minutes, and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Boutwell departed Juneau within 2 hours. It was a miracle that the Boutwell rounded up most of its crew and headed out so quickly. October 4th, 1980 was Juneau's 100th birthday, and a festive mood prevailed in its many bars. The Coast Guard cutter Boutwell traveled to Juneau from Seattle to join in the celebration, and many of the crew spent the evening of October 3rd drinking and relaxing in the area taverns. The Boutwell's Captain Lee Crum was scheduled to be the Centennial Parade Grand Marshal and was in a bar when he was called to the phone. When interviewed later, Captain Crum said, "I went up and got the microphone from the band and said, 'Anyone from the Boutwell in here? Get yourselves downstairs. We're heading back on the ship. We have a cruise ship on fire.'" He said there was such a rush to return to the ship that Coast Guardsmen sat in car trunks with their legs hanging out when there was no more seat room in the available vehicles. The Juneau Police and Volunteer Fire Department went to every bar in town, alerting Boutwell crew members of the situation. Coast Guardsman Dan Long, who was on the Boutwell, remembered loading inebriated crew members back on board. He said when guys couldn't walk under their own power, one guy would grab their arms and another would grab their legs, and they would dump them on the flight deck. Within 2 hours, the Boutwell was ready to sail with only 9 crew members missing. When Jim Pfister, the radio operator on the oil tanker Williamsburg, heard the SOS from the Prinsendam, he alerted the captain, and the tanker, full of fuel, headed for the damaged cruise ship. The Williamsburg had a helipad and would provide a vital link in the search and rescue effort. Soon other vessels also steamed toward the Prinsendam to offer assistance. On the Prinsendam, passengers and crew gathered in the lounge or weather decks. Many were barefoot, clad only in their pajamas. The cruise staff entertainers strolled among the anxious passengers, performing selections from the musical Oklahoma and other shows, hoping to distract and calm them. Some passengers asked to return to their cabins for clothes, medications, or valuables, but by 3:30 a.m., the fire had spread to the dining room, several decks above the engine room, and the cabins were on the decks between the engine room and the dining room. The cabins were off limits, and the passengers had only the clothes on their backs. Captain Cornelius Waybeck on the Prinsendam asked the Coast Guard for firefighting pumps, which the Coast Guard dropped on the smoldering vessel. Yakutat was designated as a staging area, and air stations Kodiak and Sitka each supplied 2 helicopters. Canada sent 2 helicopters and 2 fixed-wing aircraft, and the U.S. Air Force in Anchorage sent another helicopter. At 5 a.m., Captain Waybeck gave the order to abandon ship. The Prinsendam was beginning to list, and the captain feared the lower decks were taking on water. Waybeck ordered everyone off the boat except for himself and approximately 50 crew members who would stay on to fight the blaze with the Coast Guardsmen who had been dropped on the ship to assist with the firefighting equipment. The Williamsburg was still 2 hours away when the captain gave the order to abandon ship. The seas were momentarily calm, but Waybeck knew a storm was approaching. The passengers and crew jammed into the lifeboats, sometimes with 80 or more people in a single boat. Most did not have coats and had taken drapes from the lounge to use as blankets or grabbed sweaters from the gift shop to stay warm. The crew faced several problems lowering the boats and getting them away from the ship. Lines tangled, and a few boats slammed into the ship's side. They nearly lowered one boat on top of another, and the passengers and crew hurriedly piled into the boats, fearing the ship did not have enough vessels for everyone. The lifeboats had motors, but many did not work, and some boats had broken rudders. The passengers used the oars to row themselves away from the burning ship. When the passengers boarded the lifeboats, it was a beautiful, clear, starry night, and some began singing to lift their spirits. However, the weather soon worsened, and before the ordeal ended, the storm produced 45-mile-per-hour winds gusting to over 60 miles per hour, creating 30-foot waves. The passengers and crew in the lifeboats covered themselves with blankets or anything they could find. Many became seasick in the high seas. Everyone was wet and cold. Soon, many began showing signs of hypothermia. Let me take a short break. Are you still Christmas shopping? Do you need something for your true crime junkie friend or family member? How about a membership to the Last Frontier Club? Patreon only recently provided this option on its site. I'll put a link in the show notes, or go to patreon.com, that's Patreon, and search for the Last Frontier Club. If you don't see a pop-up for gifting a membership, click on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of the screen beneath the banner. One of the options should be for gift memberships. You can gift as many months as you would like for $5 a month. I provide club members with extra episodes of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier, news about the podcast, or news about current crime stories. I occasionally even mail members swag or one of my books. This is a great last-minute gift, or gift a few months to yourself and check out the Last Frontier Club. Around 8 a.m., the Williamsburg arrived on the scene of the burning boat, more than 200 miles west of Sitka. Jim Pfister described the scene when the Williamsburg pulled into position. The ship was listing to the right and in danger of sinking. I saw passengers and crew bobbing in lifeboats in the storm. After the Williamsburg arrived, the long, difficult rescue of more than 500 people adrift in lifeboats in a raging storm began. The few lifeboats with functional engines motored toward the Williamsburg, but the rest were left to the mercy of the mounting waves. The Coast Guard faced the monumental task of plucking the passengers one by one from the lifeboats, hauling them up to the helicopter, and depositing them on the Williamsburg or in Yakutat when the choppers needed to refuel. Passenger Lois Burke later wrote a letter to Coast Guard Commandant Admiral John Hayes, commending the rescuers. It seemed like an impossible task. The wind was strong and waves were very high. At first there was no space on the lifeboat where the basket could be lowered. Our boat was so crowded. Somehow, after a few passes, some of the people in the stern of our boat were able to make room and catch and firmly place the basket in the boat, and one at a time, 9 persons were raised to the helicopter and flown to the tanker Williamsburg. Once the helicopter safely transferred its 9 survivors to the Williamsburg, it returned to the lifeboat for 9 more. Paul Torres, part of the crew of one of the Kodiak helicopters, later said, "The people had been sitting cramped in a lifeboat for up to 10 to 12 hours. By the time they got into the helicopter, they couldn't get themselves out of the basket. We would actually have to pick them up and move them to the back of the helicopter." The rescuers piled as many survivors as they could in a helicopter, and Torres said, "I think on our last run, we had up to 16 survivors in our helicopter." Most of the passengers were cold and wet when they were rescued, but others were hypothermic and sick. The helicopter pilots flew those in the worst shape directly to Yakutat, and some were medevaced to Juneau for more advanced medical care. As the day progressed, the storm worsened, and it was no longer safe for the helicopters to fly. When the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Boutwell arrived, the crew deployed a launch to transfer the survivors from the lifeboats to the ship. Coast Guardsman Dan Long, who was on the launch, later recalled that this plan didn't work very well. He said they wanted to take the elderly back to the Boutwell first, but they approached a lifeboat partially filled with Prinsendam passengers and partially with the crew from the Prinsendam. He said everyone panicked when the launch pulled alongside the lifeboat, and the crew began climbing over the elderly passengers and into the launch. He said it was total mayhem. Our boat was quickly filling up, and we couldn't get the elderly off the lifeboat. Instead, the launch towed the boat to the Boutwell. When the launch reached the cutter, the crew faced another problem. Many survivors could not climb the 40-foot Jacob's ladder to the ship because their hands were too cold to grip the rungs. Long said, "We just sent a man down with a horse collar and manually hauled them up one by one." By the evening of October 4th, Captain Waybeck and the crew who had remained on the Prinsendam gave up on getting the fire under control, and they too were rescued. Waybeck was the last to leave the ship. Rescuers located the last lifeboat around 2 a.m. on October 5th. The survivors in this craft had been adrift in the storm for 21 hours. By the end of the mission, the Coast Guard had rescued 360 passengers, 190 crew, 13 crew staff, and 2 paramedics. Planes ferried the survivors in Yakutat to Sitka, and the Boutwell took its rescued passengers and crew to Sitka. The Williamsburg took its stranded Prinsendam passengers to Valdez. In Sitka, Holland America contacted John Litton, the manager of Sitka Tours, and asked him to make arrangements for the survivors. Litton realized the enormity of the situation as he watched approximately 200 people disembark from the Boutwell. He said they were coming off wearing garbage bags, nightgowns. Some of them were wrapped in curtains they'd ripped down off the walls of the ship. It was just crazy watching them walk down the long gangway. He said he expected they would need to care for the elderly people who had left the ship without their medications. He knew they would also need toiletries, but until he saw the refugees from the Prinsendam, he hadn't thought about the clothing they would all require. Litton called several shopkeepers in town and asked them to open their stores for the stranded passengers. He told them to run a tab, and Holland America would pay them later. Jill Scheidt, who owned Vise Apparel in Sitka, said the women came into her store, many wearing pajamas and barefoot. They needed everything from underwear to shoes. She said most bought clothes they could wear on the plane to fly home. She said Holland America promptly paid the tab for everything the Prinsendam passengers had purchased. Litton contacted 3 doctors in town, and they came to the hotel. The passengers approached the doctors one by one and told them what medications they were taking. Then, without a physical exam, the doctors wrote them prescriptions. The pharmacy opened its doors to sell medication, toothbrushes, and other toiletries. Litton said that when the townspeople heard about the stranded passengers, they offered hot meals and began bringing clothing and other donations to the hotel. Due to the bad weather, most of the passengers spent 2 nights in Sitka, and some stayed a few days longer, recovering in the hospital. According to the Sitka Sentinel, on Friday, October 10th, the last Prinsendam passengers left town. By then, the happy merchants needed to restock their stores. Meanwhile, the Prinsendam was now 360 miles east of Kodiak. The ship was listing badly and still on fire. A small damage control team consisting of Prinsendam crew members went on board the vessel to assess the situation. The primary fire was out, but the passageway still smoked. Holland America hired the Canadian tug Commodore Straits to tow the Prinsendam to Portland, Oregon. On October 8th, the fire flared, spreading through the ship and blowing out portholes. With each passing hour, the boat began taking on water and riding lower in the ocean. By October 10th, the A and B decks were submerged, and water flooded the promenade deck. The ship rolled onto its side 1 week after the rescue began and sank within 3 minutes. It had 188,000 gallons of fuel on board, but no oil leak was observed. Bits of debris and 1 life raft were all that remained of the Prinsendam. Since the ship sank in territorial waters, the ship's flag country, the Netherlands, conducted the investigation. The vessel rests 1 mile below the surface. No one has yet documented its exact position, but researchers hope to find it using a remotely operated vehicle. While the sinking of the Prinsendam made worldwide headlines, the story quickly faded. Rich McClear, the radio manager at KTOO-FM in Juneau in 1980, and one of the journalists who chronicled the fate of the Prinsendam and the heroic Coast Guard rescue, recalled asking an editor at a national network if he wanted the story. The editor replied that he wanted it only if someone died. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you to my patrons for your support. Check out the show notes for more information on how you can support this podcast and unlock extra episodes by joining the Last Frontier Club. If you haven't already done it, be sure to join the Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier Facebook group and chat about the podcast. I'll see you soon for the next episode of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier.
Running a business is hard work. Building your website shouldn't be. With Wix, you can express your ideas, give direction, then leave the heavy lifting to AI, from site creation to branded content and images. Have fun with the details. Customize what you want the way you want. And manage your whole business from a centralized dashboard with expert AI tools. Build, scale, and enjoy the incredible results. You can do it all yourself on Wix.